So thank you for coming. I've just been talking myself silly about private practice and incorporating interns and provisionals into private practice. The next session, this one here, is of course how we have built a private rural practice. And I have set this practice up as a satellite practice to our main practice. So it could be considered an outreach program. So what I'm going to do is today, this session really is around talking about our experience, my experience, but my team's experience, how it's worked for us, what's worked really well, some of the accidental great things that have led to the expansion of this practice, just to give you ideas around what's possible in addressing some of our rural mental health needs in our communities. So obviously I set this up long before we had telehealth. And in fact, it was the question around telehealth that led to some other accidental happenings along the way for us. So it's been a number of coincidences that are actually really awesome. Now, I am live streaming this to Facebook. So if you want to catch this later, if you have to go, it'll be on my Facebook stuff. If you're following me on Facebook, if you're not, just search for me on Facebook and you'll find me. I'm kind of a bit like a rash all over Facebook. I don't think I'm contagious, but you never know. Okay, so what was I thinking? How did this all came about? Okay, we went for a family holiday to St Helens in the northeast of Tasmania, a very beautiful part. If you've heard of the Bay of Fires, that's near St Helens on the northeast coast of Tasmania. Tasmania's a beautiful place. Come visit. I'll buy you a coffee. On our way home, we were talking about, my husband and I were talking about, the kids were asleep in the back of the car. Wouldn't it be great to have a shack on the east coast? Because it's a bit special. Crayfish, wine country, what could go wrong, right? So on the way home, we started driving around this little town of Orford, which is an hour's drive from Hobart. Perfect. It's not too far away, easy outreach location, okay? So I am putting my hand up right here and now to say it started out as purely self-interest, okay? I had an idea to have a shack. Then what happened was I went home and I actually started thinking very seriously about it. I actually started thinking about, what do I know about these rural communities on the east coast of Tasmania? And they're dotted all the way up the east coast. There's lots of there's fishing villages, and there's Triabunna, which was a pulp mill town. And I started really thinking about it. What does it mean to actually set up a bit of a practice? There's no point me thinking I'm awesome because I'm from Hobart and I'm going to go flying in on my white Charger and the great big horse, the good guy riding in on the big white horse saying, I've come to save the day. That was never going to happen. So I had to start giving it some serious thought. So what I did was I popped into a medical centre in Triabunna and said, hey, I'm a psychologist, you need one? And they went, wow, yeah. I gave them a bundle of cards, business cards. And that started a conversation. And this is where all these things really need to start, is through conversations around what's needed, what's available in these communities, what's missing in these communities. And I'll talk more about that in a minute because it's actually such an important point to make. So in the medical centre in Triabunna, the practice manager of that particular medical centre was also an ambulance volunteer. His name's Phil, and he's become a good mate of mine. He and his wife, Marianne, both ambulance volunteers, and know their community incredibly well. Chris Haig, who I'll talk about in a minute, also very closely involved in mental health in their communities. So they were really good people for me to happen to just accidentally stumble across as my first point of contact in a rural community. Phil said to me, I think it would be amazing if you could come and provide some services. And at that point I was thinking maybe one day a fortnight. I would drive up from Hobart, work with them for the day, and then the kids and I and my husband have a fabulous weekend at the beach. Hey, winning, right? So Phil said, look, that's great. I'm just concerned that people in this community are not going to want to be seeing the psych. So I'm not sure if they'll come. They need it, but I'm not sure if they'll come. And I said, okay, it's a really important point to be tucking away. Let me have a think about that. Let's just try it. Let's see what happens. So we did. And I initially started up this little rural outreach program and called it Spring Bay Psychology, because Orford and Triabunna are on Spring Bay. It's a beautiful part of the world. If you've heard of Maria Island off the east coast of Tasmania, it's just such a beautiful part of the world. So I wanted to honour the place, and Spring Bay was the name of the service initially. And I changed the name later, and I'll tell you why when we get there. And I started going up once a fortnight on a Friday. And then it became once a week, alternately Fridays and Mondays, because of course you can figure out that once a fortnight I had a weekend up at the beach, so it's still, working in my favour. And 2 GPs in that practice, one of them had been there for 25 years, had built that practice up and had such an incredible relationship with his community, and the other was an overseas trained doctor who had been sponsored by the local council and had been there for a number of years, but also very committed to that local community. And my books filled immediately, and people turned up. And they came and saw me in the GP's rooms, and they brought their kids, they brought their husbands, they brought their mothers, they brought their fathers. They just all decided this is a really good thing for the community. And it surprised me no end. So we very quickly became, from self-interested, let's have a shack at the beach people, to within 6 months I moved my family to that community, and we lived there for 3 years. Okay, so my kids attended the local school, and I was, I was like the country doctor, but I was the country psych, and it was still my favourite memories are associated with that 3-year period of my life. Still had my practice in Hobart, and so I would now satellite into Hobart every now and then to keep things shipshape. So we lived there for 3 years. Now, during that period of time, Swansea, you might have heard of Swansea, I don't know. It's a very beautiful little town, coastal town on the east coast. It's right in the middle of sort of wine country, so when you think of your Tassie wines, unless they're coming from the Tamar Valley regions, they're probably coming from the Coal Valley, which is outside Hobart, then they're probably east coast wines, and Swansea's sort of right in the smack in the middle of that. GP practice in Swansea. Before I had gone to the east coast, before I had set foot in the GP's rooms up there, I'd created a list of the GP practices up there. And I remember the day that I rang the GPs in Swansea are a husband and wife team. And I spoke to Andrew, who was the obviously the husband of the husband and wife team. And he was cynical, is probably the best word. And I couldn't quite get it. I couldn't quite understand. Sorry, it's doing something on the screen that's clearly not doing there. I couldn't understand why he was so cynical about me wanting to do this great thing. Of course, I'm still thinking, me on the white charger coming in to save the day like a great big wanker. But he eventually, not that first phone call, 2 years of conversations it took with Andrew for me to understand that Swansea, being this golden child on the east coast, this beautiful little coastal town that everybody loves and adores, Swansea was sick and tired of seeing people get funding, fly in for 6 months of service, the community just gets used to it, funding ends, they're gone. So Andrew was well within his rights to be cynical of any word that came out of my mouth. So my job over that 2-year period was to say to him, I am doing this as a private individual, offering the same service I offer in Hobart with a Medicare rebate. There was a lot of bulk billing that went on. And this is not a funded program. There is no, unless I get hit by a bus tomorrow, the program will continue. It took him 2 years to trust me enough to eventually offer us a room at no cost in his practice as well. So over that 2 years, he was like testing me. Like, he'd send the occasional referral to me, and those clients would travel the 45 minutes down the road to Triabunna to see me. And he was seeing that the results were good. He was happy with the outcome. And so over time, he trusted us enough to give us a room. The very first conversation I had with him in his rooms was around early intervention. And he was just looking at me. You could see, you can almost smell, the burning oil, with gears grinding against each other. And he said, can you just run that by me again, Tess? I said, you don't have to wait until someone's in crisis. You can refer someone to me before the crisis hits, and we can get in early. We can do some early intervention with these people. We can get in and prevent a crisis. We can get in and treat the symptoms, reduce the severity before you've got a crisis on your hands. And his eyes nearly bugged out of his head, and he said, do you realise I've never had the luxury of thinking like that before? And, it rocked me. It really rocked me to my core. And that was the first time I'd really understood the realities of our mental health crisis in rural communities. Okay. So we still have, I don't do the work in Swansea and Tribunna anymore. I have a team now of clinicians that do the travel, and they're employed to do that work. Sometimes I have students who get involved, and if you're in the last session, you'd understand how I incorporate students and provisionals. Sorry, this is rattling. I'm going to take it off. I think I know who I am. Sometimes. And so we've built up a team. Now, I mentioned telehealth. So once I really started getting a sense of the challenges in rural communities, I started wondering around how is it fair that people in rural communities can see a psychiatrist 50 times a year if they want to, and they can have a phone consult with their GP, they can have a phone consult with their psychiatrist, but they can't have a phone consult with a psychologist. How does that work? There must be a way. There must. So I had some conversations which led to other conversations, which led to some more conversations, and before I know it, I was offered a contract through our primary health network, which at the time was a Medicare local, for a little bit of money under their federally funded program to support the work I was doing in that community, which then opened it up for us to be able to do phone consults as well. So it meant that I didn't have to, as our team grew up there and I took on more people and the people were travelling to that community, they didn't have to be on the East Coast to deliver a service to the East Coast. They could do some of their work from Hobart via telephone. So this was, a few years ago now, before telehealth came on board, which meant that we could address one of the key factors that visiting services underestimate the importance of. So when I was travelling up to Tribunna from Hobart before I moved up there, and I was thinking about the hour's drive. It's an hour's drive. It's only an hour's drive. Easy. I can do that. When I was living on the East Coast, I noticed how my world shrunk over those 3 years because I had kids in school. So I had to drop my kids off at school at 9 o'clock in the morning, and if I had to be in the office in Hobart to do anything, I couldn't leave Orford until a bit after 9, which meant I couldn't get to Hobart till a bit after 10 if the traffic was okay. I had to be back in my car by 1 to make sure, 1:30 really, to make sure I was back in time to pick the kids up. All of a sudden I started to understand that rural community members have a whole lot of stuff to consider when we say, it's only an hour's drive. It's an hour's drive each way. It takes a whole day. They've got the hour session that they're coming to see you for in your urban community, and there's the petrol costs and the time and blah 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 blah. So there's a lot of assumptions that we make around what's easy and what's doable for rural community members, and again contributes to the issues that they have. So I was lucky enough that I stumbled onto Orford and Tribunna as my early entree into rural mental health, because I mentioned Phil and Marianne, the ambulance volunteers, and Christine was one of the receptionists at their medical centre as well. And she, many years ago, I was involved in a program that with the Australian Suicide Prevention Program, and Chris won an award, and I didn't remember this at the time that I met her, but a little while down the track I put 2 and 2 together, and she'd won an award, a life award, for her work in suicide prevention. So my first foray into rural mental health, and I'd landed among people who got it. They completely got it. So I was lucky that they were so supportive. We did try and move into another rural community where the GPs were quite oppositional, and sadly that relationship never got off the ground. And that still makes me a little bit sad when I think about it, because I know that community needed our support. Rural communities need us to get it. They need us to understand. They need us to know what it is like to live in a rural community, to have reduced resources, or to have resources that blow in and blow out, to be so far away from everything. And so when I lived there, obviously I was embedded in the community and I got that. And that's been a big part of what's worked for us. But you don't have to live in a rural community to be able to provide an excellent service. And that's what my team has been able to show me and the community once I moved back to Hobart, that they don't need to live there to be really good at what they do and to really want to understand the needs of the communities. So once we had that initial little bit of funding to open up our access to phone support, that worked so well that the PH then approached us and said, would you be interested in expanding up the East Coast to St Helens? So you might remember that it was a trip to St Helens that started the whole idea in the first place, and now here I was being asked to establish us as a practice in St Helens as well. The St Helens community is a beautiful fishing village. People run away from all over Australia and elsewhere in the world to places like St Helens, thinking that they're escaping their problems. And then they get to these isolated, really isolated, St Helens is 2.5 hours from anywhere, communities, and realise that their problems have followed them because, of course, as mental health professionals, we know that that's what happens. And so they have a terrible suicide rate in St Helens. So at the time that we were asked to provide services to St Helens, there had been one incredibly public suicide in the community of a young person, which was obviously very traumatic for the entire community. And not long after that, there was the suicide of a mental health professional in the community. So real double whammy of, wow, if mental health professionals can't cope, how are the rest of us meant to do it? So we, for some time, at least 12 months, sent someone up there. I rented a house, I kitted it out, took all of that on as part of the program we were going to run through this federal funding. And I had a clinician who travelled to St Helens every week and spent her weekdays in St Helens, and the rest of the time she would come back in Hobart, I should say, for the weekends. Meanwhile, it took me 2 years to woo and win the lovely Sarah, who is a mental health accredited social worker who lives in the community around St Helens, and so she's now our live-in embedded mental health professional in that community, and I'm forever grateful that we have her now. And so we are sort of at the forefront, I guess, of watching what happens in communities. Now, impact of rural suicides, it's always a bad news story when we talk about suicides in rural communities. The good news story, which doesn't get talked about often enough, the feedback we had, so I keep coming back to Phil and Marianne. Phil told one of my team members not long ago that since we established a mental health service in Triabunna, the number of call-outs that they get as ambulance volunteers for mental health reasons has dramatically dropped. So we know we're making a difference, not just because I was living in the community, not just because I went in there on my big white horse being a big show-off, but because we've committed ourselves to the community and we're doing what we can to make that continue on. 2016, another accident happened. My husband had cancer, and he's fine. It's okay. I always suffix that with, it's okay, he's fine. And while he was going through chemotherapy, the PHN announced that they were going to move from a direct contracting model for funding to a competitively tendered model of funding. So, mid-chemotherapy as a family, we decided, yeah, it's a really good idea, let's submit a tender. Yeah, don't do that. That's really stressful. But we won it. And so we won a tender to open an office in Launceston with rural outreach to Scottsdale and Georgetown, very low socioeconomic rural communities, and all the way down the East Coast. So the work we were already doing is now fully funded via this federal funding that we have, which, who knows? And I've always got Andrew's thoughts, the GP I mentioned in Swansea, I've always got his words in my mind that it's up to me to make this service viable, because when that funding, I just don't want to prove him right, I'm so stubborn, but when that funding is gone, I'm not going anywhere. We're going to make it work as a community. But what it has allowed us to do is send clinicians to rural communities, establish relationships with GPs. Now, most of them are travelling. Sarah is the only one who lives in the rural communities that we service. Okay, the rest are all outreach services from either our Launceston office or our Hobart office. The key thing that I've come to understand is, again, as I always say, it's about relationships. So we build relationships with other mental health professionals. You cannot afford to be competitive in a rural community. You've got to get to understand the other services that are available, because especially if you're a sole practitioner and you're working in a rural town that you're living in, for example, there's only one of you. There's only so many hours in a day. There's only so many referrals you can take on. You need relationships with other services so that you know who to hand clients onto appropriately, given the needs of that particular client. So while I was living on the East Coast, I grew quite close to Rural Alive and Well, RAW, blokes in hats, who travel out to the farms and just knock on doors. G'day, mate. How you going? Yeah, and just check in on each other. Make sure. It's a bit like, are you okay every day kind of a thing. And they were really well placed to support clients that we were concerned about. If there was a bit of a wait to get in to see us, because of course we're not a crisis service either. Collegiality and visibility, relationships with GPs, you've just got to do it. You've got to have those relationships in those communities. Doesn't mean you have to socialise with them, but you have to do that. Visibility. Now this is where we start. The question I'm always asked is, what about the blurred relationships in rural practice? And the story I always answer that with is, well, I had kids in the local school, which meant we got invited to birthday parties. Am I going to say no and offend the family that's invited us to a party and upset my children and upset the birthday kid who might be the best friend of my son just because the mother's client? What am I going to do with that? So what's the lesser of the two evils here? And I learned very quickly that people in rural communities respect boundaries much more than you would imagine. They really, really do. The other story I usually tell is standing in the queue at our local post office, and my littlest one, who's now 7 and knows everything about everything, you just ask him, had a God almighty tantrum. Now, he wasn't actually all that prone to tantrums, but my God, on this particular day, he knew exactly what he was about, and it was all limbs akimbo and very loud. And we knew the people in the post office really, really well, and we kind of shared a knowing smile with each other. And I allowed Henry to be Henry and just encouraged him to, get back into the real world in his own time. It's okay, so when you're ready, you hop up. And I turn around and there's 3 clients standing right behind me in the queue. And from that point on, I realised just how great it can be to demonstrate your humanity when you're a professional. I use inverted commas because farmers are professionals. They know stuff I'll never know. When you're a mental health professional in the community, you've got to be real, because they will not trust you. They won't come and see you if you're not real. They won't. They just won't. So when people talk to me about the blurred boundaries, I just say to them, use your common sense. Do not date your clients just because there are no other fish in the sea in your town. Okay. That kind of goes without saying, I would have thought. But yeah, birthday parties are okay. And I've spent a little bit of time there. I reckon every second child in my children's class is being referred for anxiety. There's something about 7-year-olds and anxiety. They sort of hit that developmental milestone. It's like, oh my God, people die. Did you know that? And they get a little bit anxious about that sometimes. So I had to just roll with that. I had to roll with people coming up and talking to me in the supermarket. I had to roll with my kid having the tantrum in the post office. I had to roll with going to birthday parties and every second person in the room was a client of some sort. It's just like, okay, that's all right. It's on me to be professional. It doesn't mean I have to be cold. I just need to be professional and know the limits to my relationships with those people. Okay. Luckily, I developed some great friendships as well, which I still have. And being able to step out of the professional, being the professional in the community and being a practice owner and having other clinicians now provide the service has made it much easier now. And I love those relationships and I miss the time that I had up there. Very precious time. That photo actually is, that's my dog. That's Miles. He's our practice dog. Was that a couple of minutes?
No, that was love dogs.
Oh, good. Thanks, Glenn. Glenn's timekeeping as well, but and my oldest son in the background, and that's a little bit of land, or a large bit of land actually, that we bought and sold. We had this idea that we might grow something, but realised we had no idea what we were doing. But our connection to the place up there is strong, and our connection to the people up there is incredibly strong. And that's, if you're going to get involved in rural practice, if you're tempted to get involved in rural practice, I really encourage you to do it because it is so rewarding. And clinically rewarding. You cannot pick and choose. You will see all comers. That's just a given, and you kind of have to get used to that. You will see all comers. And that can be quite liberating as well. So I mostly see perinatal clients now. That's my area of interest at the moment. And it was already my niche before I moved up to the East Coast. So for 3 years then I went back to just seeing all comers. And it was great for me. It stretched me. Again, we've talked about blurred boundaries. That's Buckland, which my kids love to remind me of how someone clever in the Buckland community sort of got their little white paint pot out and modified the bee to something else. I mentioned before about not proving Andrew right about services that blow in and then disappear again when the funding runs out. So we have been doing telehealth, if you like, for quite some time before telehealth formally came in. So we very rarely access the Medicare item numbers for telehealth because we've still got this funding, right? One of the key things about telehealth for rural communities is it does not accommodate the poor internet availability in rural communities. So the fact that it's still not covering telephone consultations makes me really sad. I had hoped with the most recent changes that they would have made that change as well, because it makes sense. But what you can see here is something that we did to help support our telehealth services. So these are freestanding pods in my practice in Hobart, and the one in the distance is a phone booth, and the one in the foreground is basically my office. They shut me in there like a little goldfish. It's actually got frosted glass on it now, so they're soundproof, and they're plug-inable and ventilated, and so we can actually free up our consulting rooms in our Hobart office and use these smaller spaces for telehealth work. Whether we use Zoom, we don't use Skype, we use Zoom for the face-to-face online work, and we also do a lot of work on the phones through that funded program, so we use those. But we are looking at what we can do to move beyond our funded program. How would our service look if it was reliant on Medicare? So we're already starting to, I guess, educate our clients on the East Coast about whether or not they're eligible for our funding. Technically, they are all eligible for our funding because they're in a rural community, but we can't fit them all within the budget. So how do we identify who should be a fee-paying client? So we're starting to get back to that model of identifying, basically, it's like who's billable and who's not. Mind you, these pods came from Finland, and I was so excited. Okay.
Sorry, quick question.
Yes.
How does Medicare accommodate for telehealth?
So Medicare, it's the same 10 rebates, and it used to be that you needed to have one of the first 3 in person and 3 of the 10 rebatable sessions in person. But they've removed that requirement because obviously it was a barrier to people who are really remote to be able to see anyone in person. So it's now 10. Telehealth must be visual and auditory, so you need to be online. Can't just use a phone. So it's the same rebate as if you were face-to-face with the person, same rules as if you were face-to-face with the person. Yeah. Again, I wish it was telephone as well, because I think that internet quality is a real barrier. What's not a barrier is being online with someone and establishing a rapport. We've found it to be just as effective. Fear of using a technology is the thing you've got to overcome. Once you teach a client that that's not so scary, then very quickly rapport is established just as quickly and easily as it is in the room. Yeah. So we've done some things to try to support our rural programs. So obviously we've got some contracts, we've got some funding through Primary Health Tasmania. That's the key thing that we have at the moment. That might last forever if I'm really lucky. I don't expect it to last forever, so I'm always planning ahead to what I will do differently and how I can implement some of those things, preempt disaster and implement some of those things early. So I look at other relationships that I've got. So we have a relationship with Tas Police, for example, and that is well utilised in our rural areas as well for their staff. We incorporate provisionals and interns into our rural programs under this funding model because we're allowed to, under the funding program that we have, to employ provisionals under supervision, of course, to provide services. And that just means that while we have got the funding, it's the service itself, we can deliver more services because it's more affordable. To put it in really gross terms, it's much cheaper to employ a provisional psych than it is to employ a clinical psych. Okay, it just is. And my goal is to support the provisional psychs to do great work with our rural communities and do more of it, because I could employ potentially 1.5 provisionals for the same as what it would cost me to employ 1 clinical, for argument's sake. I just made up those numbers, but you get the idea. We also work really, really hard to keep our costs down. So having secured Sarah in St Helens was a massive improvement to how efficient that service was to deliver, because she already lived in the community. There wasn't travel cost. Travel is a hugely expensive thing to pay for. So we're always looking at ways of how we can make it work more efficiently for us. This little building here, that's the shack that we bought in the end. So we lived in a big house that we rented for the 3 years that we lived there. But then just before we left, we bought this house. It used to be a library and it's got a wonderful history in the orphan community. It was a library, built as a library. It was a vet's, it was a dentist's, it was a doctor's, and then it was a playgroup centre, and it's never been a house, and now we're making it a house. So we were excited about that. But the reason we bought it was so that our staff had accommodation if they need it on the East Coast. Again, to keep the costs down, so that if we have to move to a Medicare model, our costs by then have been so greatly reduced that it becomes increasingly affordable for us to keep doing it that way. So always got to think ahead, big picture. If you know me, I'm always talking big picture, so that's part of it. So the name got changed because we were no longer just in Spring Bay. So my practice is Dr Tess Crawley and Associates, and we have 2 subdivisions of the practice, Hobart Perinatal Psychology and Rural Psychology Tasmania. And it was a very deliberate decision for me to brand it as a Tasmanian service, because we now have outreach to so many areas and so many communities that struggle financially. So Scottsdale and Triabunna were both forestry towns, so related to wood chipping and forestry work. And as changes were made in Tasmania to the laws around forestry, those towns were pretty much shut down. So I think the school, for example, at Triabunna went from about 1,000 kids down to 400. And that gives you an idea of how many families had to move away. And the ones that were left behind couldn't afford or didn't have opportunities. One of the families that we were friends with in Orford, for the whole 3 years we were there, the father lived during the week at the other end of Tasmania, because that was the only place he could get a job. So these communities do it tough. But we love them, and we do what we can. So we've just launched a graduate program, which I'm excited to be offering, which formalises the roles for provisionals in our practice and early career psychs in our practice. And that will include being supported to do rural work as part of our team. And so we have a provisional psych in Launceston who does our outreach to Scottsdale and Georgetown, as well as in-office work in Launceston. And so in Hobart we will have the same opportunities for provisionals to provide some of our outreach work to the southern east coast of Tasmania, while also doing in-office work in Hobart. So always thinking to the future about how we can expand what we're doing, bulletproof it against changes to Medicare or changes to our funding program, and keep those communities right at the heart. So I've taken you on a journey now where I've gone from very self-interested, I want a shack on the East Coast, how can I make that work for me by having a bit of a practice out there, right through to now I've built something, I've created something that has gone way beyond whether or not I have a shack on the East Coast. So treat it as something that can inspire you to do something exciting. That's it. That's it. So thank you very much. Have we got time for questions, or have we killed it? Okay, yes?
I'm curious to know how you divide your time between seeing clients, your own clients, and supervision.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how I do that. I actually have been tempted to write a book called The School Hours Entrepreneur.
You see some clients and some...
So what I practically, in real practical terms, as a practice owner, to build a practice to the size that it is now, I have had to cut back my clinical load. So I probably see clients the equivalent of maybe 1.5 days a week, and the rest of my time is supervising, building the business, meetings, and then I do a lot of other, I always discount this, but I probably spend the equivalent of maybe a day a week doing mentoring work as well for other mental health professionals outside of my practice. And trying to clone myself in the meantime. There's a question up back, yes.
Are the soundproof pods available in Australia, or did you have to import them yourself?
Yeah, there's a company called Framery, Framery. No, that's not what they're called. They're called Officescapes or something, but that's a Framery pod. So if you Google Framery, you should find them. And so I bought them from an Australian company. They imported them. Yeah, they import them. Yes. Yes.
So what's your vision in terms of if you didn't have any more funding and you only went to Medicare,
Yes.
and you've got provisional psychologist relevant services?
Yes.
So
So probably what we would look at doing then is incorporating the provisionals in like a triage role. So they would travel out to the communities and do the triage work for us, identify who belongs where, whether it's within our service and with which clinician within our service. And then we would have less outreach, more in-office work via telehealth. Worst case scenario. That's my worst case scenario. My best case scenario is to do whatever I can to find clinicians who live in communities. Embed them and support them. Yeah. So there was a photo I didn't really talk about, just to give you an idea. The one in the top left there, that's from a team-wide planning day we have them regularly. This beautiful hotel called Islington. I love it, so spoiling. And my whole team comes together at least a couple of times a year, more if we can swing it, so that they feel supported. They feel like they're part of a team. So Sarah in particular, living on her own, living with her family, but she's the only member of our team in that region. So we do whatever we can, whether it's group supervision via Skype, via Zoom, and we mix up who's in those group supervisions so they feel connected with people in Hobart, people in Launceston, wherever. It's really important to me to keep that team culture going, so that then eventually, if we can find other people to live in communities, they'll have a culture that they can step into where they will feel fully supported, even though they're living in those communities alone. Yeah. Any other questions before we finish up? No? Thank you so much. Great conversation. I know it's all one way. It's all coming out of my mouth, but thank you. Oh, and I'm clapping myself as well. It's all going on.